Royal Guard saved 5 tourists. Years later you won't believe how they returned the favor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of the palace as James Holloway adjusted his bearskin cap for the 100th time that day. 23 years of service as a royal guard had taught him that even the slightest discomfort could become unbearable during the long hours of standing watch. His polished boots reflected the early autumn light, and his ceremonial uniform felt particularly heavy today. But James wouldn't have it any other way. Every morning, he took his position with the same pride he'd felt on his first day. While tourists often saw the guards as mere photo opportunities, James knew better. Behind their stoic facades lay true soldiers, ready to act at a moment's notice. That particular Tuesday seemed ordinary enough. Groups of tourists milled about, taking selfies and pointing at the palace's magnificent architecture. James maintained his trademark stillness, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. A movement caught his attention. An elderly woman with a walking stick was making her way toward the palace gates, accompanied by a man in his 40s who James assumed was her son. 3 children, probably between 8 and 12 years old, danced around them excitedly. "Grandma, look at his uniform!" the youngest girl exclaimed, tugging at the elderly woman's sleeve. "Can we take a picture?" James kept his expression neutral, though he couldn't help but notice how the grandmother's eyes sparkled with joy at her grandchildren's excitement. The family positioned themselves nearby, the son fumbling with his camera as he tried to frame the perfect shot. That's when James heard it, the distinctive sound of horse hooves striking cobblestone at an alarming speed. His trained ears picked up the panic in the rhythm, the chaos in the approach. Before anyone else had registered the danger, James's body tensed. Through the corner of his eye, he spotted the source. A royal carriage, its horses spooked by something, had broken free from its handlers. The 2 magnificent beasts were charging forward, their eyes wide with fear, the empty carriage bouncing violently behind them. They were heading straight for the tourist area, and directly in their path stood the family of 5, completely unaware of the impending danger. Time seemed to slow down. James's mind raced through his options. Protocol dictated that guards maintain their position unless directly ordered otherwise. Breaking formation was a serious offense that could end a career. But as he watched the elderly grandmother struggling with her walking stick, the children's backs turned to the approaching danger, James knew there was only one choice. In a fluid motion that sent his bearskin cap flying, James broke from his post. "Look out!" he shouted, his voice carrying an authority that turned heads throughout the courtyard. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. The family was too slow, too scattered to react in time. With 3 long strides, James reached the group. He threw his arms out, catching the grandmother and 2 of the children in one sweeping motion, while using his shoulder to knock the son and the 3rd child off their feet. The force of his action sent them all tumbling to the side. The next few seconds played out like a scene from a nightmare. As James ensured the last child was clear of danger, he felt rather than saw the carriage upon him. The impact was devastating. Something in his back gave way with a sickening crack as the carriage's wheel caught him, sending him spinning through the air like a broken doll. He hit the ground hard, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of pain and fragmenting vision. Through the haze, he could hear screams, running feet, and the continued chaos of the runaway carriage as other guards finally managed to intercept it further down the path. "Oh my God! Someone help him!" The grandmother's voice seemed to come from very far away. "He saved us! Please, someone help!" James tried to move but found his body wouldn't respond. The pain was overwhelming now, but somewhere in his mind, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The family was safe. He'd done his duty, even if it meant breaking protocol. As his vision began to dim, he saw the faces of the children he'd saved hovering over him, their eyes wide with concern and fear. The son was on his phone, frantically calling for help, while the grandmother held James's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with us," she pleaded. "What's your name? Please tell us your name." James wanted to respond, to tell them it was all part of the job, but the darkness was closing in fast. The last thing he saw was a team of medical personnel rushing toward him, their uniforms a blur of fluorescent yellow against the palace's stone walls. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, the family tried to follow, desperate to learn the identity of their savior. But palace security had already moved in, creating a protective barrier between the incident and the growing crowd of onlookers. In accordance with royal protocol, James was quickly whisked away through a side entrance, leaving the family with nothing but the memory of his sacrifice. The grandmother clutched her walking stick, watching helplessly as their mysterious guardian angel disappeared into the palace grounds. "We have to find him," she declared, her voice shaking but determined. "We have to thank him properly." But as the family would soon discover, finding one royal guard in the vast machinery of palace security would prove far more difficult than they could have imagined. As the crowd dispersed and order was restored, James Holloway's act of heroism began to fade into the shadows of palace history, becoming just another untold story behind the famous gates of Buckingham Palace. What none of them knew then was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would transform all their lives in ways they could never have imagined. For now, though, James Holloway simply vanished, his sacrifice unmarked and his future uncertain, while 5 grateful tourists carried the weight of an unpaid debt they weren't sure they'd ever be able to repay. In the weeks following the incident at the palace, Margaret Carter, the grandmother whose life had been saved, became a frequent visitor to the palace's administrative office. Each time, she carried with her a carefully written letter of gratitude, hoping it would somehow reach the royal guard who had sacrificed everything to save her family. "I'm terribly sorry, madam," the palace administrator would say, her expression a practiced mixture of sympathy and firmness. "We simply cannot disclose personal information about any member of the royal guard. It's a matter of security protocol." Margaret's son, Richard, took a different approach. He contacted military offices, veterans associations, and even attempted to reach out through social media. But the walls of bureaucracy proved impenetrable, and their savior's identity remained a carefully guarded secret. Meanwhile, in a modest flat on the outskirts of London, James Holloway sat in his worn armchair, staring at the medical discharge papers that had arrived that morning. The doctors had been clear. His spinal injury was severe enough to end his military career. 23 years of service, reduced to a few pages of formal documentation and a pension that barely covered his basic needs. The transition from respected royal guard to medical retiree hit James harder than the physical pain ever could. His entire identity had been built around his service, his dedication to duty. Now, at 45, he found himself adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for him. The first month's pension check arrived with brutal clarity about his new financial reality. After paying rent and utilities, there was barely enough left for food, let alone the specialized medical care his injury required. The military healthcare system provided basic treatment, but the more advanced procedures that might have improved his condition were far beyond his reach. James's days fell into a monotonous rhythm of pain management and physical therapy exercises he could barely afford. His small flat, once just a place to sleep between duties, became his entire world. The walls seemed to close in a little more each day, decorated only with his framed service medals and a single photograph of him in his Royal Guard uniform, a reminder of who he used to be. The nights were the worst. Unable to find a comfortable position due to his injury, James would lie awake, his mind replaying the moment of impact over and over. He never regretted his decision to save the family, but the aftermath had left him with more than just physical scars. The silence of his empty apartment was a stark contrast to the bustling palace grounds he'd called home for so many years. As months turned into years, James's situation deteriorated. The rising cost of living in London forced him to make impossible choices. Should he pay for his pain medication or buy groceries? Heat his flat or pay for physical therapy? His proud military bearing began to slip, replaced by a slight stoop as he favored his injured side. The local shop owners who had once greeted him with respect when he passed by in uniform now barely noticed the limping man in threadbare clothes. James started avoiding social interactions altogether, ashamed of what he had become. His pension, which had seemed modest but manageable at first, proved woefully inadequate against the rising tide of inflation and medical expenses. One particularly cold winter morning, James found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the gaunt face that stared back at him. His military short hair had grown out, streaked with gray, and deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes. The perfectly pressed uniform that had once defined him now hung in his closet like a museum piece, gathering dust. He thought about the family he had saved that day. In his darker moments, he wondered if they remembered him at all, or if he had become just another tourist story to tell at dinner parties. "Remember that time at Buckingham Palace?" they might say, the details of their savior's face growing fuzzy with time. What James didn't know was that in a comfortable home in Sussex, Margaret Carter still kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about the incident. Every few months she would open it, touch the grainy photos of the palace gates, and whisper a prayer for the unnamed guard who had saved her family. Her grandchildren had grown taller, stronger, living the full lives made possible by his sacrifice, while their savior faded into obscurity. The cruel irony wasn't lost on James. He had spent his career guarding one of the wealthiest institutions in the world, yet now found himself counting pennies to survive. His service had earned him medals and commendations, but none of those could pay for the surgery he desperately needed or fill his empty refrigerator. As another winter approached, James faced the hardest decision of his life. His landlord had raised the rent again, and his pension simply couldn't stretch any further. With mounting medical bills and dwindling savings, he realized he would soon have to choose between having a roof over his head or buying food and medicine. The proud royal guard who had once stood ramrod straight before queens and presidents now spent his evenings calculating how long he could survive on beans and toast, trying to ignore the constant pain that radiated from his spine. His world had shrunk to the size of his pension check, each month a desperate battle to stay afloat in a society that seemed to have forgotten his service and sacrifice. Little did James know that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. As he sat in his cold flat, contemplating selling his last valuable possessions, the wheels of destiny were already in motion. Somewhere in London, a young surgeon was about to make a discovery that would change everything, but for now, James Holloway remained alone, another forgotten hero lost in the shadows of the city he had sworn to protect. Dr. Daniel Carter stood in his office at London's prestigious Royal Medical Centre, surrounded by stacks of medical journals and patient files. At 32, he had already made a name for himself as one of Britain's leading spinal trauma specialists. His colleagues attributed his almost obsessive dedication to the field to natural talent and ambition, but Daniel knew better. Every time he operated on a patient with a spinal injury, he thought about the nameless royal guard who had saved his family that day at the palace. On this particular evening, Daniel was deep into research for a paper on long-term outcomes in trauma-induced spinal injuries. His desk lamp cast a warm glow over the scattered papers as he pored over case studies from military hospitals across the UK. "Dr. Carter," his assistant called from the doorway, carrying another box of archived files. "These just arrived from the Military Medical Archives. They're releasing them for your research project." Daniel nodded absently, already reaching for the first file. As he began sorting through the cases, something caught his eye, a medical report dated exactly 7 years ago. The location, Buckingham Palace. His heart began to race as he read further. Patient exhibited severe trauma to the thoracic spine following impact with runaway carriage while saving civilians. His hands trembled as he turned the page. Patient name, James Holloway, Royal Guard, 23 years of service. The world seemed to stop spinning. Daniel collapsed into his chair, memories flooding back with overwhelming clarity. The sound of hooves, the blur of movement, the feeling of being thrown to safety, and the image of a proud guard lying broken on the cobblestones. With shaking fingers, he dialed his grandmother's number. "Nan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I found him. I found our royal guard." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel pulled every string he could to access James's full medical history. The picture it painted was devastating. Multiple surgeries had been recommended but never performed due to cost. Physical therapy had been discontinued when his benefits ran out. Notes from his last medical checkup indicated severe chronic pain and declining mobility. But finding James's current location proved even more challenging. His last known address was no longer valid, and his pension payments were being directed to a post office box. Daniel's mother suggested hiring a private investigator, but he knew they needed to move faster. It was his younger sister, Sarah, who finally had the breakthrough. Working as a social worker in London, she had contacts throughout the city's support services. A description of a former royal guard with a spinal injury led her to a homeless shelter in South London. The shelter worker's description made Daniel's blood run cold. "Oh yes, James. Proud man, military bearing despite his injury. Started coming in about 3 months ago when the weather turned cold. Never asked for much, just a warm place to sleep sometimes." The Carter family gathered at Margaret's house to plan their next move. The guilt in the room was palpable. While they had lived their lives in comfort, the man who had saved them had lost everything. "I saw him just last week," the shelter worker had said. "He was asking about temporary housing programs. Said he'd lost his flat recently. Wouldn't take any handouts, though. Kept saying he'd manage somehow." Daniel stood at his grandmother's window, watching the rain fall. "We let this happen," he said quietly. "All these years, we've been living our lives, and he's been suffering alone." His medical training told him what years of untreated trauma and inadequate care would have done to James's injury. The original surgery had been basic, focused on immediate survival rather than long-term recovery. With proper treatment and rehabilitation, James might have maintained a much higher quality of life. Sarah arrived with more news, each detail more heartbreaking than the last. James had been selling his possessions to pay for pain medication. His military medals, his service photographs, everything except his Royal Guard uniform had been sold or pawned. The final blow came when they obtained his complete military record. James had received a commendation for his actions that day, but it had been filed away without ceremony due to his medical discharge. The very act that had saved their lives had been reduced to a footnote in a personnel file. Daniel spent the night reviewing every detail of James's medical history. The initial injury had been severe but treatable. With modern surgical techniques and proper rehabilitation, there was still hope for significant improvement. But first, they had to find him. The next morning, Daniel and Sarah headed to the shelter, but James wasn't there. They spent hours searching nearby parks and streets, showing his photograph to anyone who might have seen him. As the day wore on, their desperation grew. Finally, in a small park near the Thames, they found him. James Holloway, once the embodiment of military precision and dignity, sat on a bench in clothes that had seen better days, his face lined with pain and hardship. The proud posture of a royal guard was still visible beneath the weight of his circumstances, like a ghost of his former self. Daniel approached slowly, his heart pounding. "Mr. Holloway?" he called softly. James looked up, his eyes wary but still alert. "Yes? My name is Daniel Carter. 7 years ago, you saved my family outside the palace." Daniel's voice cracked. "You saved my grandmother, my father, my siblings, and me from a runaway carriage." James's expression changed, a flash of recognition crossing his face before he quickly composed himself. "You've grown," he said simply, his voice hoarse from disuse. Daniel knelt before the bench, tears forming in his eyes. "We've been looking for you for 7 years. Please let us help you now." The proud man on the bench stared at Daniel for a long moment, and in his eyes, Daniel could see the battle between dignity and desperation. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't do it for thanks." "No," Daniel replied. "You did it because it was right. And now helping you is right. Will you let us try?" The Carter family transformed their Sussex home's guest house into a temporary medical facility within 48 hours of finding James. Daniel had pulled every string at his disposal, calling in favors from colleagues and medical equipment suppliers. The small space now rivaled many private clinics, equipped with everything needed for James's recovery. Your injury is complex but not irreparable, Daniel explained, showing James his MRI scans. They sat in what had become James's private treatment room, morning light streaming through large windows. The original surgery was basic trauma care, but with current techniques, we can do so much more. While Daniel focused on James's medical care, the rest of the Carter family launched what they called Operation Royal Guard. Richard Carter, Daniel's father, reached out to his contacts in the media. Sarah used her social work connections to document the systemic failures in veteran care. Even young Emily, the youngest of the Carter grandchildren, contributed by starting a social media campaign with a simple hashtag Remember the Royal Guard. Margaret Carter took on perhaps the most challenging task, breaking through the palace's bureaucracy. Armed with James's service record and medical files, she was no longer asking for information but demanding action. Her letters now went directly to senior military officials, detailing how a decorated royal guard had been abandoned by the system he served. "It's not just about James anymore," she told reporters who had begun gathering outside their home. "How many other soldiers have we forgotten? How many more are suffering in silence?" The story caught fire faster than anyone expected. Local papers picked it up first. International media began calling, each outlet adding pressure to an already building storm. Military veterans organizations rallied around James's story. Former Royal Guards came forward with their own experiences, creating a movement that went far beyond one man's tragedy. The hashtag Remember the Royal Guard began trending nationwide, with thousands sharing stories of military service and sacrifice. Meanwhile, Daniel focused on James's recovery with laser-like precision. The first surgery lasted 11 hours, with Daniel leading a team of top specialists who had volunteered their services after hearing James's story. In the operating room, Daniel worked with the focus of someone repaying a life debt, his hands steady as he repaired years of damage. "The surgery went well," Daniel told his family in the waiting room. "But it's just the first step. We're looking at months of rehabilitation, possibly more surgeries. But for the first time in 7 years, he has a real chance at recovery." The public response grew into a movement. A petition demanding reform of military pension and healthcare systems gathered millions of signatures. Parliament members began asking questions about veteran care policies. The palace, feeling the pressure of public opinion, was forced to acknowledge the situation. Sarah organized a support network of social workers and veteran advocates, ensuring that James's case would help others in similar situations. She worked tirelessly to document everything, building a case study that could drive systemic change. "We're not just helping one man," she explained during a television interview. "We're exposing a broken system. James's story is tragic, but he's not alone. There are thousands of veterans who need our help." James watched all of this from his recovery bed, overwhelmed by the attention but gradually accepting that his struggle might help others. The physical therapy was grueling, but he attacked it with military discipline, pushing through pain barriers that would have stopped others. "You've started something remarkable," Daniel told him during one therapy session. "The military pension system is under review. There's talk of comprehensive reform. Your story is changing lives." The media coverage reached a fever pitch when a group of current Royal Guards broke protocol to stand vigil outside the hospital during James's second surgery. The image of these proud soldiers standing at attention, supporting their fallen comrade, became iconic overnight. Public pressure finally forced the government's hand. The Minister of Defense announced a complete review of veteran care policies. James's case was cited specifically as an example of systemic failures that needed to be addressed. "No soldier who serves their country should ever find themselves forgotten or homeless," the minister declared in Parliament. "We are committed to ensuring this never happens again." The palace, initially resistant to involvement, began to shift its position. Questions about why James's commendation had been filed away without ceremony led to uncomfortable revelations about how injuries in the line of duty were handled. Richard Carter's media contacts ensured the story stayed in the public eye. Documentaries were planned, books were commissioned, and James's experience became a rallying cry for veteran rights advocates across the country. As James grew stronger, The movement he had inadvertently inspired gained momentum. Veterans' charities reported record donations. Support groups formed nationwide. His story had touched a nerve in the national consciousness, reminding people of the debt owed to those who serve. The Carter family's determination had not only saved James but had sparked a revolution in how Britain treated its veterans. What began as a plan to help one man had evolved into a campaign for national change. "You've done more than save my life," James told Daniel during a particularly challenging physical therapy session. "You've given hope to countless others who thought they were forgotten." Daniel smiled, supporting James as he took another difficult step. "You saved 5 lives that day at the palace. Consider this the interest on our debt." As James's strength returned, the movement continued to grow. The story of the royal guard and the family he saved had captured the public's imagination, becoming a symbol of both society's failures and its capacity for redemption. But for the Carters, it was still personal. Every small victory in James's recovery was celebrated, every setback fought with determination. They had found their guardian angel, and they wouldn't rest until he could stand tall again, not just for himself, but for all those who had served and sacrificed. Spring had returned to London, and with it came a day that would be remembered in British military history. The grounds of Buckingham Palace, where James Holloway's story had begun 7 years ago, were prepared for an unprecedented ceremony. The carefully manicured lawns gleamed under the morning sun, and rows of chairs filled the courtyard where James had once stood guard. In a private room within the palace, James stood before a full-length mirror, hardly recognizing himself. After months of surgeries and rehabilitation, he stood straight and tall, his spine finally healing properly under Daniel's expert care. His Royal Guard uniform, perfectly pressed and polished, fit him as if he had never left service. Each brass button gleamed, each crease razor-sharp, a testament to the dignity that had never truly left him, even in his darkest hours. "Ready?" Daniel asked, appearing in the doorway. The young surgeon who had changed his life now stood beside him, both men reflected in the mirror, one in surgical scrubs, the other in military dress uniform. "Almost can't believe it's real," James admitted, adjusting his ceremonial sword. The pain that had been his constant companion for years had faded to a manageable whisper, thanks to Daniel's revolutionary surgical techniques. Outside, the courtyard filled with distinguished guests. Military officials in full-dress uniforms sat alongside members of Parliament who had championed veteran care reform. Journalists from around the world gathered at the designated press area, cameras ready to capture this historic moment. The Carter family occupied the front row. Margaret, now using a golden-handled cane, sat proudly between her son Richard and granddaughter Sarah. Emily, no longer the small child James had saved, sat beside her grandmother, clutching a small package wrapped in royal blue paper. At precisely 11 o'clock, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. The band of the Royal Guards began playing as James emerged from the palace, escorted by senior military officials. Each step he took was firm and sure, a far cry from the broken man who had sat on a park bench months ago. The Lord Chamberlain stepped forward, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he read the official proclamation. "By order of Her Majesty's government, we are gathered here today to right a wrong and honor a hero." James stood at attention as his service record was read aloud. 23 years of unblemished service, countless commendations, and finally, the moment that had changed everything. The official account of that fateful day 7 years ago brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Without regard for his own safety, Guard Holloway broke formation to save 5 civilians from certain death. In doing so, he demonstrated the highest values of the Royal Guard and the military tradition. The Minister of Defense stepped forward, holding a velvet box. Inside gleamed the newly created Sovereign's Medal for Exemplary Courage, a special commendation created specifically to honor acts of extraordinary bravery by military personnel and civilian protection. "James Holloway," the minister spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You stand before us today not just as a royal guard, but as an example of what service truly means. Your sacrifice reminds us that the duty to protect others knows no boundaries of protocol or procedure. As the medal was pinned to his chest, James stood impossibly straighter, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But when Margaret Carter rose from her seat to join him on the platform, his composure wavered slightly. 7 years ago, you saved my family without asking for anything in return, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed courtyard. Today, we stand here not just to honor your bravery then, but to celebrate the man you are, a man who never lost his dignity, his courage, or his commitment to service, even when the system failed him. Emily stepped forward next, presenting James with the small package she had been holding. Inside was a framed photograph of James in his guard uniform from that fateful day, salvaged from military archives. Alongside it was a new photograph of him with the Carter family, taken during his recovery. Family isn't always about blood, Emily said, her voice steady despite her youth. Sometimes it's about the moments that bind us together forever. The ceremony continued with the announcement of the James Holloway Veterans Care Initiative, a comprehensive program to ensure no other service member would suffer as he had. The legislation, fast-tracked through Parliament, promised sweeping reforms in military pension systems and medical care for injured service members. As James stood at attention for the playing of God Save the King, he caught sight of the current royal guards standing watch around the palace. Each one had tears in their eyes, their usual stoic expressions softened by the weight of the moment. The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement. James's original post outside the palace would bear a small plaque commemorating his act of bravery. It would serve as a reminder to all future guards that their duty to protect others sometimes required breaking from tradition. As the formal proceedings ended and the crowd began to disperse, James found himself surrounded by the Carter family. They were no longer just the tourists he had saved, they had become his family in every way that mattered. Thank you, he said simply, looking at each of them in turn. Not just for this, but for refusing to let me disappear. Margaret took his hand, her eyes bright with tears. No, James. Thank you for showing us what true courage looks like, not just in saving us that day, but in every day since, when you faced your struggles with dignity and grace. As they stood together on the palace grounds, James Holloway was no longer the forgotten hero or the broken soldier. He had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of human connection, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are recognized not in the moment they occur, but in the lives they continue to touch long afterward. The spring breeze carried the sound of the Royal Guard band playing in the distance, and James stood tall, his medal catching the sunlight, a visible reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not in the moment of sacrifice, but in the long journey back to wholeness that follows. 3 months after the palace ceremony, James Holloway stood before a classroom of fresh Royal Guard recruits at the Military Training Academy. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the eager faces of young men and women who would soon take their places guarding Britain's most prestigious posts. Protocol is essential, James began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. But compassion and quick thinking are equally important. Your uniform represents more than tradition, it represents a sacred duty to protect. After declining the Carter family's offer to live with them, James had found his true calling. The Military Academy had created a special position for him, Senior Advisor for Guard Training and Veteran Affairs. Here, he could shape the future of the service while ensuring no soldier would face the challenges he had encountered. Between lectures, James worked closely with military leadership to implement the reforms that bore his name. The James Holloway Veterans Care Initiative had already begun transforming lives. Weekly meetings with defense officials and healthcare administrators filled his calendar, each session focused on improving support systems for injured service members. Sir, a young recruit raised his hand during one session. Weren't you afraid of losing your position when you broke formation that day? James smiled, remembering his own days as a fresh-faced recruit. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about my position. I was thinking about 5 lives that needed saving. Sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks. The key is knowing which risks are worth taking. His new apartment, provided by the Military Academy, overlooked the Thames. Unlike his previous life of solitude, his days were now filled with purpose and connection. Every Sunday, the Carter family insisted he join them for dinner, and these gatherings had become the highlight of his week. During one such dinner, Daniel shared news about other veterans benefiting from the medical procedures developed during James's treatment. Sarah spoke of support groups flourishing across the country, while Emily proudly showed him her university thesis on military service and social responsibility, inspired by his story. "You've created quite a legacy," Margaret observed, watching James interact with her grandchildren. "And not just in the reforms and medical procedures. You've changed how people think about service and sacrifice." James had indeed become a powerful voice for veteran care, but he found his greatest satisfaction in the quiet moments with new recruits. His office at the academy became a safe haven where young guards could seek advice about their struggles and fears. "Remember," he often told them, "strength isn't just about standing still at your post. Sometimes it's about knowing when to move, when to help, when to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves." The Academy Commandant noted a marked improvement in recruit performance under James's guidance. His training programs combined traditional discipline with emotional intelligence and critical thinking. Guards were now better prepared for the complex challenges of modern service. One autumn morning, exactly 8 years after the incident that changed his life, James returned to his old post outside Buckingham Palace. The small plaque marking his act of bravery had become a popular spot for tourists, but he wasn't there to reminisce. A new batch of guards was taking their positions for the first time, and James watched with pride as they assumed their posts. Among them was Thomas Carter, Richard's youngest son, who had been inspired by James's story to join the Royal Guard. "Uncle James," Thomas had said during his graduation ceremony, the honorary title had stuck despite no blood relation. "I hope I can serve with half the courage you showed." As James observed the changing of the Guard, he reflected on how his life had transformed. The pain that had once dominated his existence had given way to purpose. The loneliness had been replaced by family, both the Carters and his extended family of recruits and veterans. Later that day, James led a veteran support group meeting. The room was filled with former service members, each with their own story of struggle and resilience. As he listened to their experiences, he realized that his greatest achievement wasn't surviving his ordeal. It was helping others survive theirs. "Your story gave me hope," one veteran told him. "If you could rebuild your life after everything you went through, maybe I could too." Back in his office, James kept 2 photographs on his desk. One showed him in his Royal Guard uniform on that fateful day, and the other captured him surrounded by the Carter family at last Christmas. Between them stood a small frame containing his medal, a reminder that courage comes in many forms. The sun was setting over London as James finished his day's work. Tomorrow would bring more classes, more meetings, more opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, he had dinner plans with his family, not by blood, but by something stronger, the bonds forged through sacrifice, recovery, and unconditional support. As he locked his office door, a recruit hurried up to him. "Sir, do you ever regret it? Breaking formation that day?" James paused, looking out over the academy grounds where future guards trained. His voice was firm as he replied, "The only regret would have been not acting. Sometimes life puts us in positions where we must choose between what is expected and what is right. Those moments define us." Walking home through the twilight, James Holloway smiled. His story wasn't just about a heroic act or a remarkable recovery. It was about the ripples one moment of courage could create, touching lives far beyond the original 5 he had saved. His uniform might have changed, and his role might be different, but his commitment to service remained as strong as ever. He was no longer just the guard who had saved 5 lives. He had become a guardian of something far greater, the spirit of service itself, and the promise that no soldier would ever have to face their battles alone. The evening light caught his medal as he walked, and somewhere in the distance, the sounds of the Royal Guard band played. James Holloway, once forgotten but now remembered, strode forward into his future, knowing that his story was far from over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one that would inspire generations to come.